Hi everyone, it's Jessica, and I want to welcome you back to my channel. I've discovered that this upbeat, perky voice I'm doing, especially in the mornings, it seems to attract Willow's attention. So I'm just going to allow her some time to get used to the fact that I'm talking to a camera and not to her. Today's Sunday, so we're going to do sort of a casual conversation about the Nevers. It's the second to last before the break. There are going to be 10 episodes in the season, but because of COVID, they were only able to shoot these 6. They felt like there was a natural pause, and they decided to put these out and then continue with the other 4 later. I don't think there's a scheduled date for when the last 4 will release. And based off of what I'm seeing here in episode 5, which is the first episode that was drastically affected by the COVID-19 filming restrictions, they probably should have just waited to release all 10 episodes together and not done this episode 5 the way they did it. It really has let a lot of viewers down, whether you've been enjoying the show for a long time, or you've been on the fence, or you haven't liked it. I think everyone agrees that they're not a huge fan of episode 5. They have to jump in time a month, and I don't necessarily have a problem with that. A lot of stories that I write or stories that I read will go from one point in a chapter establishing certain things, and then they're doing stuff that's boring in between, so we just jump to a month later when they're ready to do the fun plan. The one thing I think was most troubling in this episode as far as a time jump goes is there's the word Galanthi that they're using to describe whatever the thing underground is. I really think they should have found a way to work that into conversation ahead of time. I understood what it was and why it was there, but it just felt really lazy. I don't think a voiceover is the right way to go, or like a speech exposition dump. I think all of those are also kind of lazy. I think it was worked very clumsily into the episode, and if it was just this one thing that was clumsy, we could kind of overlook it, but there's a lot of clumsy elements, like the fact that True and the doctor are now back involved in a relationship. That seems to not make a lot of sense. A lot of people are having trouble with some of the new characters being involved in the orphanage without an official introduction. That part I'm okay with. I understand how Nimblejack made it into the orphanage. I do think those couple of lines dropped about him facing Desiree and from there getting cleared to join the group was kind of clumsy. We could have just had Bonfire Annie and Nimblejack training, and they could have been talking about the Galanthi or the upcoming mission they're preparing for instead of why Nimblejack is in the orphanage. Like, obviously, if they let Bonfire Annie into the orphanage, then Nimblejack can come in without any trouble too. We find out in this episode that the government was responsible for Mary's death, and they were also responsible for Amalia True's attempted assassination. And I think actually revealing who's responsible and it being the government is a huge letdown and missed opportunity here in the show. Because it would have been really interesting if Mrs. Bidlow had been involved in the orphanage, in discovering the Galanthi and the experimentation happening on some of the touch, and also she was in contact somehow with Maladie and sort of had an inkling of that, because she has this line here in episode 5 where she tells Augie not to go to the hanging, and we could interpret that as her just generalized fear about what will happen at the hanging, or her fear that Augie is like a sensitive soul and the hanging will be too much for him, or we could interpret that as she knows that something is going to go down with the hanging and she doesn't want her brother there when it happens. And I kind of like this interpretation the best. I like to think that Mrs. Bidlow is exploring a bunch of different avenues with the touch. So I did not like that the government just revealed all these mysteries. And this is something that the show is failing to execute as a whole. It's giving us like a million things to look at. There could be these deeper mysteries and subterfuges that they could weave these things together and overlap them and confuse the viewer, or really like make a more complicated and intricate mix of things going on. Everything antagonistic that's happened to our main touch characters so far is the government doing is disappointing, really, because it makes us wonder like why we have this Mrs. Bidlow bit going on in the background, why the ferryman exists. We really haven't done anything with this pagan sex cult or its existence. So it just feels like a bunch of wasted, missed opportunities and a bunch of like look over heres that aren't going anywhere. And the other thing about it that I didn't like is it's just really binary. That on one side you have the mostly women touched going up against an authoritarian, all-male government. Men against women. I don't feel there's anything nuanced to explore here. And and even less nuanced when you think about like disenfranchised, disempowered people up against a large, authoritarian, controlling government. Another thing that was a huge disappointment to me was the whole Penance deciding that she would go save Maladie. Up until this episode, all of the touched in the orphanage have been against Maladie. No one has been like, oh, poor Maladie, she's misunderstood. Or like, oh, if we could only get to her, we could help her somehow. This has not been a theme for 4 episodes. And then randomly, in the back quarter of the 5th episode, the 5th out of 6, Penance is like, hey, I feel bad for Maladie and I want her to be free. I understand maybe they didn't want a public execution, especially because that wasn't a thing. It was something they were doing specifically because Maladie was touched, that they might disagree with the public execution. And I even understand if they had had a larger anti-death penalty message, but the message is, Maladie is touched, I won't let them kill touch people, and also I will just let murderers run free if they're part of my group. That was like a weird message for them to put into the show, and I don't understand why any of the touch would want to intervene. Like, Penance gives these passionate, emotional speeches about it, and I don't know where this passion or emotion comes from. Maladie has killed 15 people. We learned that in this episode. You're just gonna let her continue to run around? We know there's no plans for what to do with her afterwards. She can't come back to the orphanage, so they're not gonna contain her there. And no one at the orphanage wants her there. They think she's too dangerous to stay there, but they're just gonna release her on the general population. And it seemed to me like the whole reason that Penance had this impulse to save Maladie was because they wanted to do like a rescue heist with a bunch of fun inventions, and they couldn't find a real way to justify it. And then the last big thing I want to talk about with this episode is the twist that Maladie is actually Effie, and that the real Effie Boyle has been murdered all along. In fact, she was the first murder victim that Mundy found in episode 1. And I have a lot of problems with this twist. At least 2, 3, possibly like 4 or 5 months ago, this reporter had been killed. And then Maladie somehow steps in and impersonates Effie, believably to her coworkers and her peers, for months. We have seen nothing of Maladie that would make us believe that she could do this. She has spoken in incoherent riddles. She is dressed entirely inappropriately. She's worn this grease over her face, never taken it off. She's the only one in the show who has bad teeth. She doesn't visually look like she could fit in, and she doesn't look like she has the verbal or mental capacity to fit in, let alone impersonate someone else believably enough that she could maintain cover like that. And then on top of that, even if she could do that, even if she could step into someone else's life and impersonate them in a believable way, or maybe Effie, as a female reporter, she just didn't have a lot of friends and family, and her coworkers just didn't really care about her. They just sort of dismissed her as a woman, so it was easy for Maladie to step into that role. Why would she do that? How could she have known maybe 6 months ago that she would be captured, be publicly executed, and be able to revenge against anyone viewing her public execution? I can see her doing the switcheroo, having her loyal follower take the fall for her, and us finding out later that Maladie is still running free. But I just can't see a world where they know specifically to put in a reporter into that situation. In fact, I'm not even sure they needed a reporter. Like, why does Maladie even have to do that? She could have been spending her time doing all kinds of stuff in the background while people assume that she was caught. What would she have done if the judge hadn't decided on a public execution? How was she so sure? The actual scheme as it's enacted doesn't make any sense to me at all. There's all these disjointed parts because of COVID that a good writer would have found a way to work with. The fact that they couldn't figure this out just shows bad writing, or it shows stubborn writers, or it shows lazy writers. Like, either they were so stubborn and set in the story they were telling that they were going to find a way to make it happen even with COVID, or they were lazy and they said, oh, people will forgive us because of COVID, they'll understand that this episode is disjointed. And neither one of those is really good storytelling. A good storyteller figures out a way to work in the constraints they're given. And you know, I don't think I'd be super harsh on this episode if it was earlier in the season. Like, if we had started with episode 3 and episode 5 was episode 3, and I knew there were 3 more episodes coming, I'd be like, this is a little bit lazy, it's a little bit bad, but it's not a terrible midpoint. But as like a preparation to go into a finale, or a preparation preparation to go into a break, it is really terrible. And since this is how HBO decided to release the program, I'm not excited for episode 6. I don't know that I care so much about what happened to Amalia's group when they were underground. I know that Amalia came back and all the people who went with her came back because I saw them at the end of episode 5. I want some answers about the Galanthi. Is it like a second ship that had been trapped previously, and the one that flew over London is the one that crashed and disintegrated while trying to rescue the underground one? Or is it the same ship and somehow it got itself underground? Is the thing an egg, or is it an AI, or what is it under there? I've seen the previews for episode 6, like the little teaser, and it looks to me like possibly the egg thing is some kind of dragon about to hatch, and I'm not into that as a plot line. Galanthi means snowdrop, and as far as that goes, it would be really cool to me if this was some kind of fae magic. That would also make sense given the place that it happened, and also the way that these powers are manifesting for humans. And we could even possibly see that like the people who are touched have some kind of like fae blood mixed in with your human blood, and that's what was activated. Even though that's my ideal outcome for this show right now, I don't think that's what's happening. My second ideal outcome was that Amalia was some kind of lady from the future, but that doesn't fit with dragons, so I don't think that's what's happening either. And I'm not 100% sure the predictable thing, the aliens thing that I talked about in episode 4 is what's happening either. Or like that big creature's eye opening that they showed us in the teaser for episode 6 is a trick somehow, which I guess is what I would most hope for at this point in time, because I do not want a creature, like a sentient creature, to come out of the spaceship like that. I just don't think it's interesting, and I think it's too disjointed from the show that we've been watching. And for you to go on a break after that happens, no, I'm not into it. So that's my thoughts on episode 5. I didn't think it was well constructed. Episode 1 and 2 are objectively bad. Episode 5 is just poorly told, but some of the things that are happening are interesting or leading to something interesting. The problem with it is that we're on the second to last episode, so they're leading into something I might never see, which never feels good. To me, this felt exactly like what they did with Dollhouse season 2. The second to last episode did a big time jump like this and led us into a finale, and they did that because Dollhouse was canceled and this is where they were going with Dollhouse, and they wanted to show us the last 2 episode finale of what would have happened over 5 seasons. It feels exactly the same way here with the Nevers, where we've had one plot line going at one kind of pacing, doing its own thing, and we just jumped in time into an action/conclusion. And where I understood that happening with Dollhouse, and I even kind of enjoyed it because some of the subtleties and nuances happening in Dollhouse were happening a little bit slowly, to be fair. So just driving it to its logical conclusion was kind of exciting and fun. Like, yeah, these are all the things I'd seen slowly happening, and here it is now in my face. There's just not enough material with the Nevers for the same thing to be happening. There's not a lot of things that are slowly driving, and here's a logical conclusion. In fact, there's all these things slowly driving that were letting us speculate, have fun, play with the show, like in forums and stuff, and now they're closing the book on that and wrapping it up way before I want to wrap up our closure, and they're forcing me to move on into something that doesn't feel like it connects to the show that I've been seeing previously. Overall, storytelling wise, I don't think the Nevers is doing a good job. I think the Nevers has a serious problem with character consistency and with creating an interesting plot line with all the pieces they drop down. It feels like they don't know what to do with all the pieces themselves, or like they're just going to discard a whole bunch of pieces that they've been making us pay attention to. I wish for the best. I'm still going to see episode 6, and I'm going to hope for something satisfactory to wrap up. And I'm still hoping they'll do the last 4 episodes of season 1, and maybe a season 2, just depending on how those episodes go. But at this point in time, I've probably downgraded the show from like a potentially A to B to like a solid C rating. And depending on what happens in episode 6, it might go down. Episode 6 would have to do a lot to improve the rating. But thanks for listening to me talk. Thanks for joining me in the Nevers and these episode evaluations. Everyone who's been watching, I want to mention how grateful I am for all you guys. These Sunday releases have done really well on the channel, and there's been a lot of interest, and I want to talk to you guys briefly about what will happen after episode 6. There are a couple of things I could do. I could do more deep dive and intricate things about the Nevers, about its overall storytelling loop or about the characters in specific themselves. Or I could move on to another show. Right now I'm looking at possibly Solos, which is releasing on Amazon Prime right around the time that this show is wrapping up. So if you guys go ahead, leave me a comment down below. Let me know if you want more detailed dives into the Nevers on Sundays, or if you would prefer to get a new show like the Solos on Sundays in this kind of style. And if you enjoyed this video, please go ahead, leave me a like. If you like content like this with a storytelling analysis for fantasy and science fiction features, please go ahead and consider subscribing. I do weekly casual Sunday releases around 1 p.m. that are more smaller and more single episode focused. And I do look at larger overall works that are more detailed and more structured on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. It does have a little bit of a book focus, but I still reach out into shows as well. In fact, recently I did a reaction to episodes 1 through 4 of Shadow and Bone on Wednesdays, and you can check that video in the iCard here. So thanks for watching, thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you guys next time.